Chelsea Vowel is Métis from Manitou-Sakahagan,
Close enough.
Lake St. Anne, Alberta, currently residing in Amiskawasi-Waskahikan, Edmonton, mother to 3 young girls with another on the way. She has a B.Ed and an LLB and is currently a graduate student and online Cree language coordinator at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Chelsea is a public intellectual, writer, and educator whose work intersects language, gender, Métis self-determination, and resurgence. Co-host of Indigenous feminist sci-fi podcast, Métis in Space, and author of Indigenous Rights, a guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit issues in Canada. Chelsea also blogs at Apihiwa-Kasusan. Is that even close?
That's closer than most, yes. Good points.
Miigwech.com and makes legendary bannock. Listen, if you didn't get that URL, come and find me afterwards, and I'll make sure you find that URL. On a personal note, if I may, before I invite Chelsea up, her blog was profoundly important to me during the time of Idle No More, and I consider her to be one of my teachers and one of my guides in coming to understand some of the complexities of the world around me. So it's with great gratitude that I invite Chelsea Vowel to the stage to continue the Weweni lecture series.
All right, so I may grab this and wander around. I'm a walker. Tansi nito temtik. So Chelsea Vowel nitigastan igwamantu sa kaignik nito tsin maga niwigan amaskwatsi was kaignik anots. Egwa nisto nito tanasin peakuta. So coming from Lac St. Anne, it's Treaty 6 territory, and thank you for having me here. And the first thing that I want to do before I even launch into my spiel is I want to trouble territorial acknowledgements. So territorial acknowledgements are something that have become fairly common all across Canada, mostly in institutions. And it's interesting to me to think about where those territorial acknowledgements are not happening, right? So they tend to happen in universities. More and more they're happening when there's engagement with urban Indigenous communities, but they're not really happening anywhere else, right? They're not happening when people are out plowing their lands. They're not acknowledging the territory they're on. They're not happening, over in the oil sands up by Fort Mac. Nobody's acknowledging those territories other than unless it's in a press release, right? So what's the purpose of territorial acknowledgements? Most of the universities that have sort of taken this on would say, well, it's an acknowledgement of our shared history. We want to talk about whose territory we're on, and that should raise all sorts of questions. But I think ultimately, when we stop being uncomfortable with territorial acknowledgements, then we need to do something else. And I feel, just over the past couple of years, that we're all very comfortable with territorial acknowledgements. It doesn't make people sweat anymore. Nobody's going, oh, I'm on stolen land, and feeling bad about it. And it's not that I want people to feel bad, just a little. But I do want people to question, right? And it's just become this sort of invocation that happens before any sort of event. And without that discomfort, I think that it's sort of losing its power. So my challenge to you would be, what's after territorial acknowledgements? What do we do when we're all really aware of whose territory we're on? And I would suggest that the next step would be that we figure out what that actually means. What does it mean to be a guest in somebody's territory when you weren't actually invited? Are you really a guest? Did anybody ask permission to build this building here? Are we really guests? I mean, you can be given that status after the fact. And I would say that, there's been attempts to welcome people into territory once they've already been established there. But what does it mean to be a guest? And Indigenous nations, all of them, have protocols about that, how you behave in somebody else's home. And as well, hosts have obligations to their guests. What are those obligations? Do you know what they are? So I would say that going past territorial acknowledgements, we need to find out those things concretely, not metaphorically, not like, okay, I acknowledge now that I'm a guest and you're my host. We can't just say it, we have to actually find out what those legal orders are and how they would govern our behavior. So that's my challenge to everyone. And in those spaces where territorial acknowledgements are still unsettling, in those absence spaces, I would like to see them brought out, outside of urban centers. Let's go out to town halls and in rural communities, have those territorial acknowledgements and have people shifting in their seats. And then once they're comfortable with it, then you move on. Right? So My topic today is indigenization in the time of pipelines. And I would say that this is linked to reconciliation, right? Indigenization, whatever that is seen as sort of the answer to the question of how do we reconcile? Well, we're going to indigenize all the things. Like, what does that mean? Do we put like dream catchers up over everywhere? And you know, it can be tokenistic or it can be deeper. And I think that there's attempts being made on all of those levels, right? How effective they are is something that we're going to have to evaluate. But we're in a time right now when this is happening amid increased pressure to ram through extractive resource development, like really rapacious extractive resource development, stuff that we know is just, it's not sustainable, right? But we're fudging the science. You know, Trudeau's sitting there saying all these mealy-mouthed things about making new nation-to-nation relationships, but he's ignoring the fact that if you're in a nation-to-nation relationship, you should be able to say no to things. And that consent is lacking. So here we are, we've got all these major developments that are being rammed through, and people are fighting them pretty seriously. And this is also the age where we're being told we're just going to fix it all. We're going to reconcile. We're going to indigenize all the things, and we're going to build better relationships. So I'm just a little cynical, not a lot. So I wanted to share a story with you. On my way to the airport yesterday, I get into a cab, and you know, so he picked me up right outside of the Faculty of Native Studies, and he says, well, what's Native Studies? What do you guys do there? You just talk about Native stuff? Like, you know, it's, if you've ever had to sort of justify your studies to somebody in 30 seconds or less, you're like, wait a minute, what am I doing, right? It really got me thinking, what do we do at Native Studies? And I said, well, you know, we fight against whiteness. We try to understand colonization, colonialism. We want to understand our histories better. We want to find the words to say the things that we know to be true in ways that will reach others, right? And he's like, oh, okay. And then he starts, you know, because I'm white-coated, so he looks at me as a white person and figures I'm safe to say things to me that he would not say to other people. So he says to me, okay, well, I've had lots of Native people in my cab. You know, why, you know, the government gives them so much money. Why are they like they are? They, you know, not you, you're clearly different. So, you know, why are things so bad? And I kind of look at him and I go, well, you know, have you heard of residential schools? And he says, no. And I'm going, oh my gosh, like there's been this whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all this information out there, and he's never heard of residential schools. So I tell him a little bit about residential schools, and he looks at me and he's, you know, very polite. He's speaking very politely with his words, maybe not so much with his questions, and he goes, that's shit. He was very emphatic about it. He said, that's not justice. How could people take children? Nobody does. Who does that? What kind? Canada is the worst. You know, and he had started off talking about his immigrant experience. You know, we came here and we want to have a good life and everything. And he said, I can't believe this. I can't believe that. And, you know, we talked about a few other things. We talked about lack of potable water. And he said, that's a basic human right. And I'm like, I know, right? You know, and so through the course of this cab ride, you know, we're in rush hour, so it lasted a little under an hour. He went from, you know, what's wrong with Native people? Why can't they get their stuff together? To armed insurrection. Like literally, it's like, why don't people get up and fight? And I didn't have time to tell him about Oka, and I didn't have time to tell him about Standing Rock, you know, like one thing at a time, right? You know, he didn't even know about residential schools. He's not going to know about our mobilizations and the fact that, like, at no point in history have Indigenous people stopped fighting or resisting, you know, in many different ways. But that's all it took. It took that amount of time to get somebody who was very invested in the idea of Canada as a just society to go, what's wrong with you people, to like, oh my gosh, Canada's the worst. Why don't you fight it, right? So that was a bit heartening for me, because that's literally all the time it takes. We do need to study and understand the impacts of colonialism, and we need to understand whiteness as a structure and how it affects all areas of our life, and we can get really deep into that, and you know, if you're in school, you're going to study it really intensely. But it really only takes less than an hour for any human being to hear about this stuff and go, that's not right. And when we get to the point where we can know that in our guts, but move beyond it because we feel like there's justifications for it, well, we need pipelines over here, we need to compromise. Like, that's the messed up part. Not the gut feeling of this is clearly wrong, but the whole like, okay, it's clearly wrong, but, right? So we want to get people to that, back to that feeling part of this is clearly wrong and go from there. Like, let's stop with the justifications. All right, so one of the things that I also think about is the way that so many people mobilized around this last election. People are constantly asking me, Trudeau's better, right? And I have to be like, depending on who it is, either I'm very honest about it, very blunt, I'm like, no, he sucks. Or I'm like, this could be better, right? But look at how many people mobilized to bring out the vote, rock the vote. Got a lot of Native people voting when that, for a lot of us, that's a real issue. We're like, we're not part of this state, we're not Canadians, voting is weird, it's stepping into the wrong canoe. But people got out and voted because they thought, this guy is promising to implement all 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He's promising to implement UNDRIP. Maybe this is gonna be different. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because that's hope. Right? That's people full of hope that things are going to change. And I sort of feel like every generation has to have their hopes dashed. and honestly, if you don't have them dashed at this point, then you're not paying attention, because none of those things have been done. Right? UNDRIP is not being implemented. We don't get to consent. We don't get to say no. We don't really get to say yes in a way that is enforced. So you can talk and talk and talk and talk, but if the actions don't follow it, then nothing's changed. And one thing I would say is, for all the people who do feel let down, that's something we've all had to go through. This is generations of hopes dashed. And that's not saying something about Indigenous people. We're not bad because we hope, because we expect that other people will behave in a responsible way, that they'll actually follow through with their promises. I think that's us, like, maintaining something beautiful in the face of just horrific disappointment over and over again. So we haven't lost that ability to hope. We haven't lost that ability to believe that other people can be human beings in the realest sense of the word. Having those hopes dashed just means that you have to look at the history of what has happened in this country. And I would say, in terms of having a resource for that, the late Art Manuel just passed recently. He wrote a book called Unsettling Canada. It was a wake-up call. It's fantastic, because it's a very accessible way to look at how previous generations fought, what they were up against. He names names in there too, people in government at the time who are in government now. You start to see the linkages of how the language shifts, right? So, people talk about in the bad old days when they were still using terms like savages and civilization and things like that, where we can look at it now and say, well, that's obviously wrong and racist. But things got better. Right? Now they're not talking about assimilation anymore. They're talking about, opportunities and Indigenous peoples as resources, untapped resources. By the way, what a creepy phrase. Like, you want to tap my resources? What? Like, I picture all these tubes, right? It's gross. We're people, not resources. But the language shifts, right? And every generation is like, okay, the language has shifted. Maybe the attitudes have shifted. And they try to make those relationships, build those bridges, reach out again, only to find out that the attitudes and the policies haven't shifted. It's the same thing. From John A. Macdonald to Trudeau, the same thing. And it's to remove Indigenous peoples from our lands and our resources so that they can be accessed for the benefit of non-Indigenous peoples, and not even all of them. Like, this system isn't really working for anybody, right? The royalty system that's in place to deal with resource extraction, most of that money doesn't stay in Canada, right? So it's flowing through the hands and benefiting the very, very few. But if you stand in the way of that, it's very threatening, because you're dealing with people who are relying on those industries to feed their families. Literally, I go to work to make this money to feed my kids, and you want to get in the way of that. You're threatening somebody's family. That's how it feels to people, right? So we're seeing, Indigenous people are, as threats to people's families, when we get in the way of this sort of resource extraction, or we question whether or not it's beneficial. And that's something that we have to always be aware of, because when you feel like a threat to people on that level, then they will justify anything, any use of force against you, because it becomes that personal. So Canadians at large have to really question that narrative that they've been fed. Canada only exists as a nation because it sits atop Indigenous lands and resources. This is only a wealthy nation because of those lands and resources, and yet we're constantly characterized as a drain. You know, we're all on welfare and we're all taking tax money and this and that. Well, the biggest welfare state in the world is Canada. All right. I mean, all of that for me just means we really have to move beyond the state. We can't put all our eggs in one basket. The next election isn't going to change anything. Canada is never going to question its sovereignty over these lands. It's never going to undermine its foundation. So while it's important that we have lawyers and politicians, Indigenous peoples who are in different areas within those structures to sort of try to make internal changes, we really need to focus beyond that. We really need to start looking at our own capacity, and that comes down to relationships. So one of the things that often comes up when you're talking about Indigenous issues is, well, you guys signed land away. What are you complaining about now, right? To which I always say, never happened. Never happened. You know, we're in a treaty area, and it's always assumed in treaty territories that there was a land surrender. But that's because you're looking at it as a property transfer. But what really was the relationship? What is the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the land? It's not about property. It's not like this is my stuff. It's about a series of relationships. You have relationships with your human kin. You have relationships with the plants and animals. To the extent that we actually form treaties with those plants and animals, there's rules governing how we relate to one another that don't just benefit humans. It has to benefit the plants and animals too. You know, and if that seems strange to you, or you can't understand how that could be, I'll give you an example. So back in my home territory, the Nakota peoples had treaty with the beaver, because the beaver would alter the landscape in such a way to ensure that there was fresh water. You know, they build those dams, they create these little lakes, and there's fresh water dotted throughout their territory that benefits everybody. Benefits the beaver, benefits humans, benefits other animals. So if you hunt the beaver too much, you know, then you're interfering not just with an animal's life, you're interfering with the water life. You're interfering with what sustains you as you travel through those territories. And that's treaty, that's law. You don't go breaking that law without consequences, and the consequences are very clear. So if you extend that beyond, you know, that one example, and we try to reestablish these relationships that we once had with plants and animal species, that's a basis of, you know, of environmentalism. I mean, we don't need people to tell us what environmentalism is. That's it. People need to come to us and be like, how do we do this? Well, let me tell you. Let me tell you a story about the beaver. We have those relationships, but we also have relationships with non-living beings, right? With the landscape itself. Some of the landscape's living, some of it's not. But it also has to do with our relationship with our ancestors, with a realm that is not separate from us, which is often talked about as being our spiritual realm. But we're in those relationships. We have our ancestors who do ceremony for us, and we do ceremony for them. And that's a real thing. That's not something we just, you know, it's not a metaphor for anything. So if you have all of those relationships, you know, simplify it down to thinking of like, and I don't mean this to be paternalistic, but just think about it as those are your kids. Okay, you got some kids there. And it's your responsibility to take care of them. So Muniaos come, white people come, and you're just gonna be like, here, take my kids? When those people don't even understand that these are children. They see it as property, right? So are you gonna take your children and say, it's all on you now, it's your responsibility, you take care of it, we're backing away, we don't have that responsibility anymore? Would anybody do that? They don't even see them as children? There's no way, it never happened. Nobody gave up that land, nobody gave up those responsibilities. It's still our responsibility to bear, to maintain those relationships. And it's really difficult in the situations that we've been put in to maintain those relationships. Some of those relationships have been severed. Some of those species are in such poor health that we can't do anything about it, where it's really, it's past the point of no return in some cases. So when people tell me, well, you gave up the land, what are you complaining about now? I'm like, you got it all wrong. It's really about relationships. And so when we talk about indigenization, I don't want to see symbolic things. I want to see a return to that relationship basis, that understanding of the world. And it's something that as Indigenous peoples, we have to do as well. A lot of us have had those connections broken in different ways, and we don't even understand it anymore ourselves. So those are things that we have to reclaim. And again, I keep coming back to, if you've ever read Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, none of this should be metaphorical. None of this should be theory. This should be actual living on land practice. And it's particularly difficult when we're in urban centers to have those connections to the land, even though urban centers exist on the land, right? We're on the land. This is not some other space. But you get taken up with so much in your life that you don't have time for those things, or you think you don't. But that's where I think real indigenization needs to come in. We need to understand those relationships again. And that means even reclaiming land that's in urban centers. The Boy Scouts of America and Canada have this system where they take kids out and they teach them all these skills. And they have all sorts of money and they can do these camps and stuff. And we don't. We don't have the money. We don't have the capacity. We've got tons of urban youth who would love to do that kind of stuff. And we don't have like the native version of that. But I would like to see that. So if there's any like philanthropist millionaires here, just step up. We could use a couple $1 billion. So going back to those relationships, I think is really, really important. That's one of the alternatives I would say to continuing to look to the state for solutions. So we turn inwards, we learn about how to be better kin to everybody. I would say that part of that is constructing or reconstructing our own truths as well. Because this is a common complaint that's made about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that after the reports came out, everything moved to reconciliation really quickly. And the commissioners themselves said, whoa, it's not time for that. We're not at that point yet. Canada 150 is here celebrating 150 years of, colonialism. But we don't have truths. We have a sliver of truth out there with what it was released with the commission's report. We still haven't even touched on sterilizations. This is something my mother was sterilized in 1985. There was no law at the point. It was just policy that when a woman who had a lot of kids, particularly a Native woman had a lot of kids, was in labor, you offer them a hysterectomy. Because hey, why not? Most vulnerable point in your life when you're giving birth, and it really, really hurts, and you kind of don't want to ever do it again, and somebody says, I got a way to make sure it never happens again. You're like, yes, please. That's not ethical. And it's still going on. There's cases of that going on into the 90s, into the 2000s, right? So that's another layer of truth that needs to be uncovered. I mean, there's tons of stories out there that we need to know. And it's not just Indigenous stories. I mean, I'm just discovering that there were Black communities in Alberta, Amber Valley. I'm just learning about things, the way that Newfoundland was directly benefiting from the slave trade because they were trading salt cod in return for goods that were produced by enslaved Africans. Canada likes to paint itself as this exceptional country, different in every way from the United States. But there's so many truths there that we don't know. And further to that, there were relationships between Indigenous peoples and Black communities. So what are those relationships? What happened? How were they severed? What histories are there, right? Those histories, which often, I'm just learning this stuff in my MA, these new vocabularies, micro-histories and things like that, history for the margins. But it's not. This is like the real stuff that went on that just gets glossed over because white supremacy is everything, right? We just center whiteness. And so when I talk about relationships as an alternative to, this sort of like namby-pamby reconciliation, it's not just relationships with ourselves, and it's certainly, we have to stop making a binary of Indigenous and white people, right? Settlers and Indigenous people relationships. We have to look to the other populations here. We have to gather together and braid together those truths to understand what's happened in this country and to understand where we can go from here. So my focus really has been, over the past couple of years, to stop always looking, I took a law degree, and that's all about relationships with the state. I'm a teacher, and that's all about relationships with the state. What's the curriculum? How do they mandate it? All of that. Trying to change these processes, when I think we're much better served talking to each other. And I'm saying kinship, by the way. I don't want to romanticize it. We were talking about earlier that, family relationships can be pretty dysfunctional and messed up, but it's still kinship. It doesn't matter if you have a screwed up family, okay? It doesn't matter if you're all messed up in your own way. You still have obligations and relationships with each other. So focusing on turning away, the refusal of centering whiteness all the time is something we all have to do, including white people. And I shied away from saying white people for a long time because it makes people really uncomfortable to be labeled as white when everybody else has a name, but you're just the norm. You're the baseline, right? But I think that, as we're seeing in the South, and we're not that exceptional. Just because Trump's down there doesn't mean that we're that much better. Not naming whiteness is really going to take us bad places, right? When we're afraid to talk about these things, about these structures and these privileges, these intersections, then people take advantage of that. They take advantage of your discomfort and they just steamroll the same oppressive stuff over you. So I think one of the things we have to do is, when it comes to telling truths, we have to name things properly. Ways not to do it. I recently attended a presentation by a Métis author who did 4 flute solos and said that there were no libraries in the North, that we don't have any heroes and our elders don't read enough. I'm sure there was other things that were said, but those ones really stuck out at me as like, what are you talking about? So this guy was talking about how, he was a white guy for most of his life, and then he had a dream, and his grandmother came to him and sort of like bequeathed upon him his indigeneity, right? And since then, he's gone around educating people about how you can also dream your way into indigeneity, right? Through your totem or your spirit animal, it could be anything, even a beetle. Although you notice nobody ever has like the slug as a totem or a spirit animal. Nobody's ever like, a skunk. Like, it's always like the eagle, the bear, But that's something we gotta face. That's not what I'm talking about. Those kinds of relationships are not what I'm talking about. You can't just think your way or intuit your way or dream your way into change, into indigeneity, and into relationships. Instead, the process of indigenization, it can't be just theory. We need theory, but we need praxis as well. So it has to be a process. We have to think about things, and especially at the institutional level, particularly right now. How are we going to support students who are going out and being land defenders? Because this is something that's coming up right now. I have a friend at the Faculty of Native Studies who left her studies to go be at Standing Rock, right, and support that fight. There's people who, you don't have to go to Standing Rock. There's places all over where people are putting themselves in harm's way. Elders, children, just people who are on the land protecting it. And, some of our students want to go do that. So what do we do when they come back and they've missed a bunch of exams, or they're on some sort of council and they didn't fulfill their duties? We actually have to have these conversations. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to help that student catch up? And are we going to get mad at them because they dropped everything and went and did something that honestly is like the most important thing you can do, physically be there on the land? And not everybody can, right? We can't ignore the fact that some people just don't have the capacity to do that. And so there's no shame there. We have to support them as well. But what do we do in those situations? How do institutions, which are funded by the state ultimately, in Alberta we talk about divesting from oil money, but it's all oil money trickling through one way or another. How do we support those students? How do we resist in the academy, right? This is a big thing. How many, Is there anybody here that's not a student? Are you all students? Not a student, but you're implicated in the academy somehow? That was a very leading question. So one of the things that Indigenous students often face are questions about, what are you doing here? You know, like how is what you're doing, how are you studying? How is your studies going to support community? Like what benefit are you? You're going to a colonial institution. You know, you're just gonna start thinking like a muniao. What's up with that, right? We always have to justify ourselves. And this is something that I think we come into really questioning for ourselves too. Like, what's my purpose here? Right? What am I accomplishing? And I think that Adam Gaudry, who's a professor at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, wrote a piece about, what did he call it? Insurgent research. You know, all these nice concepts and stuff, or things that I think we fundamentally understand, is that ultimately we didn't get to these institutions on our own. We didn't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps or whatever myths. Community got us here, one way or another, right? So if community got us here, if that support got us here, then we owe our knowledge to community. And we also have to resist the feeling that we owe the academy too much. Where's our ultimate loyalties, right? It's to community, and it's to fighting and resisting colonization. And if we can't do that within the academy, then maybe it's the wrong place for us. But that's something that you have to evaluate as you go along. You have to say, how is what I'm doing pushing back against that white supremacy? How is what I'm doing pushing back against colonization? How is what I'm doing resisting all of that pressure to just assimilate? And it's a really terrible burden. You know, a lot of non-Native people can just come to school and just go to school and enjoy it. But we have all this like guilt for our, you know, how are we helping our families? How are we helping our communities? So in a non-metaphorical way, how are we supporting Indigenous students with those questions, right? Those are serious things that we're dealing with all the time. So we can't just talk about it and say, oh yeah, I acknowledge, I acknowledge that we're here, you know, benefiting from your labor and your time and your teaching, because Indigenous students are expected to teach a lot, you know? Have you ever been that one student in the class, somebody asks something about Native people, and everybody goes, and you're like, I haven't even had a coffee. I don't even know that. I'm not from there, you know? It's a lot of emotional labor. And I mean, there are a lot of students, there are a lot of Black, Indigenous, you know, people of color students who are expected to do that kind of labor for free. And nobody really understands the emotional toll it takes. So indigenization in our institutions that don't take that sort of strain into account is just, it's not beneficial to us. It's going to burn us out, right? So that's another real thing I want these academies to think about. How are you supporting these students who are sort of torn between their loyalties and are really being overtaxed? Let's see, what else do I want to talk about? Wait, what time do we have here? What time do we end?
1:30.
Okay, because I want to make sure I get some questions. Okay. All right, another thing I want to talk about, because I'm really about tangible things. Like, I've been teaching for 15 years. It's really weird to be back in school where everything is sort of like up here, really theoretical, and you do a lot of research, but you don't do stuff, you know? Like, it makes me all like itchy. So, you know, when I'm asked to talk about these things, I'm like, I want real stuff. Like, I don't want talking points. So one of the things that I think that we need to do is introduce like praxis, our Indigenous praxis, into everything that we do. And one of those I would talk about is sort of radical citational policies. So who are we uplifting when we do our research? One of the big things that I like to say is like very little of what I am saying right now is original. You know, I'm not that original. all of this stuff I'm saying comes from the influence of many people over my life, right? These are things that have been taught to me. And as much as possible, we need to acknowledge where our knowledge comes from, and center ourselves in, you know, our locations, where we're from, our backgrounds, all of that. Really like truth-telling, like who are we, you know? This is what people were asking Boyden, who are you? You know, and if that's a difficult question, then we have some problems. And it doesn't matter if you're disconnected. It doesn't matter if you've been adopted out. It doesn't matter what the situation is. Just be honest about it, because that positionality is really, really important. It totally frames how you see the world. So radical citational policies also goes to thinking about some of the dysfunction in our own communities. So we might like what somebody has to say, but what if they're abusive towards their partner? And this is real stuff, right? If you know that somebody produces great work, but they beat their partner, are you going to use their work? That's something you have to think about. For me, it's very clear that I don't accept that anymore. I will not cite those people. I will not use their work. Because it didn't just come from them anyway. It's not so important that it comes from this one person. That came from community. That came from many different people. So find people who aren't crappy, right? If you know that this one person is consistently dating grad students who are like half his age and saying, well, she's really mature for her age all the time. Like, I'm sorry, what? You're benefiting from patriarchy here and you want to talk about how radical you are? I'm not buying it. And when a Two-Spirit youth stands up in front of a bunch of Indigenous scholars and says, where are queer and Two-Spirit Indigenous youth in your Indigenous future? And there's nothing but uncomfortable silence. The answer needs to be right here in the center of goddamn everything we do. Everything we do. And it can't just be lip service. Those silences, those people that we hold up and valorize who we know are doing crappy things in community, we have to hold them accountable and we have to hold ourselves accountable as well. And that's part of those relationships I'm talking about, is we can't be silent about dysfunction. We do have to find ways to bring people back into community when they've messed up, but it can't be just by forgiving them and saying, well, better luck next time. Not when we know that they've left damage in their wake. So the answers to, how do we indigenize, how do we reconcile? It's not going to be with a bunch of mythical grandmothers that come to you in your sleep. Which is just a projection of white settler possessiveness, a way to create a moral claim over lands and territories without doing any of the relational work that needs to be done, without actually changing anything. We need to hold each other accountable, and we need to just also take our energies and focus them where they're sort of more needed. Let's not worry about the state so much. I mean, we're constantly going to have to resist what's going on, but we also need to build ourselves up. And, in spaces like this, again, comes back to, if people want to be out there defending the land, how do we support them? How do we support the students that are doing all this teaching and this emotional labor? How do we support students who are disabled? How do we support our queer students? How do we support everybody? How do we make real relationships with one another in ways that don't require one person to be completely drained while the other is fulfilled, right? Another thing I just want to mention is that Kim Tallbear, who's amazing, I got to take a class with her. It was so cool. It was like being in his, with a celebrity every time. You're like, I don't even want to say anything, just keep talking. But Kim Tallbear talks a lot about being careful not to label things pseudoscience, right? When you talk about some of the ways that people have been classified over generations, phrenology, where they felt the bumps on your head and decided how human you were and things like that. That wasn't pseudoscience at the time, that was science, right? It was the science of the time. And in every generation, we're dealing with the science of the time, right? Right now, related to this talk, we're dealing with environmental science of the time, which is total crap. All these projects that are being pushed through are being supported by cherry-picked science, right? And years from now, we're going to look back at this and say, man, that was pseudoscience, that was fake, that was BS. But it's not right now. It's the science. And I would extend that to say, be careful about dismissing political ideology as well. Because we can look back at the time of John A. Macdonald and say, clearly racist, clearly racist. We can look back at, Trudeau Sr. with his white paper and say, clearly racist, right? But people are looking at Trudeau right now and saying, probably not. Maybe he's just confused, right? Because there's this idea that as time goes forward, and time is so linear, it only goes in one direction, everything has to get better, and everything is smarter, it's wiser, it's more factual, right? We're living in a time of, and I almost want to thank Trump for this, because it's bringing these things out, this alternative facts and stuff like this, is everything is as dishonest as it was 150 years ago. But people really believe it and they're really invested in it. So it's not enough to just dismiss those things as like, this is obviously crap. We have to put forward very rigorous arguments to deal with these things. We have to name them properly. And in order to resist those things, we really, really have to understand that. And I think one of the best things that coming back to school has done for me is it provides me with vocabulary for things I already feel. I already know this stuff. You already come to this with an incredible amount of knowledge that you carry with you. But being able to articulate it in specific ways, to know how to name it, to know how to talk about it, is a very, very powerful tool. And that's something that you can bring back to your communities. We're constantly being critiqued for the way that we speak. You talk in ways that are inaccessible. And it's true. We do. We really, you come to school and you learn a whole new jargon and vocabulary, and it is inaccessible. So we need to break that down. Once you understand something well enough, you should be able to explain it to a little kid. You honestly, this is how I practice. This is how I decide if I know something. Is my kid says, what the heck are you talking about? And if I can't explain it in 30 seconds or less, then I'm like, I don't know what I'm talking about, right? You need to be able to break those things down. And that's kind of the job, I think, of everybody in the academy, is to be able to take those concepts and take them out to people. But also understand that communities already have an incredible amount of knowledge and vocabulary that they bring into the mix too. So when it comes to those radical citational policies, be honest about all the cool crap you learned on Twitter from people of color, Black women, Indigenous people. You're probably out there in social media learning just amazing, cutting edge stuff, but it's not happening in the academy, so it's not being acknowledged. But we need to start acknowledging those things. All right, so I want to have some questions here. So I just want to end with, we're up against a lot. We're going to continue to have these conversations, honestly, for generations to come. We're not going to solve this in one swoop. But if you come out with anything, it's just remember, when you feel like it's too much, like you can't deal with the state, everything is it's overwhelming, we've been fighting for generations and things are not getting better, just remember that all it takes, honestly, is a cab ride. You talk to somebody for less than an hour and they go from what's wrong with you to armed insurrection. So go have those discussions with people, because fundamentally we know that things are not right, things are unjust. We just have to take that feeling and do something with it. And the way that we're going to do something with that is to support each other and build relationships, not by just constantly theorizing and thinking about how guilty we feel. Right? Hi.